In this episode, we consider the extent to which the reaction to the release of a apparently manipulated photo of Kate Middleton may preview the world we're entering, where reality, real reality, and synthetic realities are impossible to distinguish. And later on, we'll consider the evolution of dating apps in light of the recently filed class action lawsuit that contends that dating apps now are more about engagement and keeping you hooked onto the actual app than actually connecting you with other people. Hello, welcome to the Call Like I See It podcast. I'm James Keys. Riding shotgun with me today is a man who likes to drop lots of good stuff for the people in every episode. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to make it rain today?
Yep.
All right.
Get your umbrella out.
All right. Now, before we get started, if you enjoy the show, I ask that you please hit subscribe on YouTube or in your podcast app. That helps us, get the message out to more people, to get the signal out that they should come check us out. Now, recording this on March 19th, 2024. And Tunde, last week there was a huge media firestorm following the release of a portrait by the UK royal family. It was released by the royal family with Kate Middleton. It was showing Kate Middleton and her kids. Now, the photo was released on Mother's Day, or Mother's Day in the UK. So, that would seem pretty innocuous. But what made this have a big reaction was that the photo, once people looked at it, was apparently manipulated. And that, combined with the fact that Middleton has been out of the public view for the past few months due to a medical matter or a health matter, has led people to kind of make up their own or come up with their own reasoning for why they would release a manipulated photo and so forth. And more notably, with no one who's doing all the speculating or doing all the discussion on this, having any objective way to distinguish between whether what they're saying or to prove what they're saying or to disprove what anybody else is saying. So Tunde, with looking at this, do you see this Kate Middleton potential Photoshop thing as kind of a preview of the world that we're in now, where we have improving tech like generative AI and deep fakes? And it really comes down to the idea that people can no longer believe or cannot believe what they see. And everyone kind of just operates in this create your own reality mindset. You see what you see and you decide whether you'll believe it or how you want to interpret it on your own, as opposed to saying, okay, well, this is what this means or whatever.
It's interesting because as you're talking, it makes me think of like the metaverse. And, for those who may have seen it, the film Ready Player One that came out almost a decade ago. No, but this idea that, we can all just put on our own goggles and live in our own fantasy. That in a sense, when it's in that environment, it's not as dangerous as when that happens in the real world. Because if we run into and collide with someone in the metaverse or in that, internet reality, that stays in there. But when you're dealing with colliding with people, let's say on your own block, who see a totally different reality than you do, that can have real world consequences.
Hold up, man. Did you even see the movie? I thought the whole point of the movie was that the things that they did in the metaverse started having real world consequences.
Yeah,
I'm messing
exactly.
with you.
And I think this Kate Middleton thing to me is another layer, another example in this recent kind of era that we're in, the recent years, where something that doesn't seem that important on its face, like, we haven't seen the lady for 3 months and that's her business, just somehow gets this viral fire. And we have now, I'd say at least a quarter of the world talking about it. And like you said, with a lack of clarity, it allows for the human mind, for many people, to go to the most negative or conspiratorial things instead of maybe the lady had surgery and she wants some privacy, right? And I think that's why it's just fascinating for me to watch this from the outside looking in, because there's a lot of things think about with the royal family, their public family, all that. But then it's also like, well, who are we as the public to sit there and demand someone show themselves after a surgery? And like, we have to know, and I just
But I
wonder.
mean, that's kind of the royal family is not like, I don't think that point applies to everyone across the board. Like the royal family is kind of like celebrity culture in the UK. So part of their bargain with the public is that they do all this public facing stuff. So, I mean, that piece, but I think I want to look at the tech piece, because part of this was that once the photo was released, it would the manipulation, the apparent manipulation was so crude that people recognized it and realized it right away. I mean, so to the extent that news organizations pulled it and said, "Hey, we're not going to distribute this photo anymore because we don't, we don't see it as authentic." And that, to me, that happens. What's interesting to me about that is that that's almost in converse to, like, we operate in this world now where we are aware that there are these generative AI that can create things, or deep fakes. And kind of the defining characteristic of those, as that tech gets really good, is that you can't really tell the difference. Like by visually, you can't visually, or it's very difficult as that tech gets better to really tell the difference. In this instance, kind of the tip off was how easily we could see the difference, or that people that study these kinds of things. I wasn't looking at it, but the people who look at these things and are like, oh yeah, your sleeve here and you're all this other stuff. And so it was almost like I'm sure they didn't do this on purpose, but if they wanted to kind of bring a lot of attention to themselves and stuff, it would be kind of a like, hey, this is kind of they left the breadcrumbs already. But more so the analogy of, okay, well, we're entering a world now where they released this photo and then X amount of people decided, I don't believe that this photo is legitimate. And then from there, once you've knocked down the kind of initial premise, then without an alternate premise, you can create your own, or you can buy into this person's premise or that person's premise. And so I think it was a very good preview of the world that we're entering, where something will be released. Now, whether or not it obviously can be distinguished or not and say, okay, well, this is real, this isn't, but something will be released. And then absent some other intervening factor, people will just have to decide what they want to believe, based on either what that makes them feel good or all these other factors. This has been looked at, but they'll just have to decide and say, okay, well, I want to believe blank because I can't prove that what I'm saying is true objectively. Like, I can give you arguments for it, I can give you reasons, but I can't prove it, and you can't disprove it. What I'm saying now, I guess, presuming you choose the right few shared realities that can, not be disproved. But and so it'll just be a matter of choice. What to believe will become a matter of choice. And so I think this does really illustrate that, even though in this case it wasn't done in a way that actually makes the fact of the matter unknowable. Like news organizations were able to conclude that they thought this thing was manipulated sufficient that they would pull it from circulation.
Yeah, I think that's where this is proof that we are still in the early stages of us figuring this out, because you're right. The news agencies.
in this case, they're thinking this is like a Photoshop or a photo editing. And then they acknowledged, I think, that the royal family did acknowledge later on that they did manipulate it, but not for just kind of touch up was what they were claiming.
Well, but let me just address where you were saying is that the news organizations spotted something fake because they have their own ways of detecting things. I'd doubt that at first was a human being that showed it. They probably have their own AI and algorithms that'll quickly alert them to say, hey, have a human check this because it looks fake. And then people go and check it. And I think that's interesting because they did that to the actual source of the fake information that was trying to put it out themselves, versus we often think of the threats of these deep fakes, AI generated stuff and all that as coming from maybe a third party that's trying to damage the reputation of maybe the targeted person, let's say in this case, Kate Middleton. So I found that interesting that the news organizations automatically rejected something that actually legitimately came out of the royal palace, even though it was an illegitimate photograph, right? The second thing is, and just to finish off on the royals, because I know our show will be greater than just this specific topic on this family, but I do think, and I agree with you, I feel like this is more a sign of incompetency than some vast conspiracy of the royal family, because kind of like we discussed and joked around with the COVID vaccine, if the government was really trying to put nanobots and 5G into people's, injected into their arms, they'd probably use something like the flu shot or tetanus shot.
They would use something people were already accustomed to doing.
Yeah,
they wouldn't do it in something new.
Exactly. And so I think like if the royal family really tried to deceive the public for real, like if they went into this saying, all right, we got to put a campaign for whatever reason, Kate's not going to show up for another 6 months. We got to make it. I'm sure. I mean, they have the resources, right? They'd hire the best digital media companies out there and stealthily and quietly, and they would have created some real content that looks great. Yeah. The fact that all of us laymen's out there could see this and spot it very quickly tells us that, it was probably them rushing to respond to public pressure. And they had some people in the royal office that are not that great at technology do Photoshop stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, that's an interesting point in the sense that the existence of all these other tools, the fact that theirs was done in like kind of a mid 2000, 2005, 2006 Photoshop way, like people have better, people manipulate photos better on Instagram than this. Yeah.
Think about it. I'm thinking in my mind, like Bernie Madoff made up fake statements that looked real, right? And that was 20 years ago. So all I'm saying is, and Photoshop's been around for 30 years. So some of this stuff are not necessarily new. The ability to just make things that look fake, or we've seen it used in, let's say, by certain media companies where, it looks like there's all these hordes of people climbing across fences on the border, on the southern border. And then I learned later, those were pictures coming out of like Morocco. Yeah. But it just looks scary because of a bunch of brown guys going through like barbed wire fences.
And I wanted to get to that actually in the sense that what we're talking about here, you can find analogs to this throughout history, actually, or at least recent history, the photographic history, in the sense that people think the moon landing was fake, and that was a staged, and that like I don't know how many people, but nonetheless, it exists. that was a staged like production.
That's another show, by the way.
Sorry to open
for
that
the audience. We'll do that one day.
Yeah, sorry to open that up for anybody. I'm not trying to go all the way down that road, but just saying that it doesn't necessarily have to be a quote unquote altered photo. It could be a misattributed or something that someone thinks is staged. Is the same kind of an issue. So this isn't completely new in that sense, but what the discussion really gets to is how, as the tools for this stuff get better and better and better, to where a discerning eye may not be able to tell the difference. Like you can't get in and analyze it and say, okay, this is, if you look at the sleeve here, or if you look at the way the hair is cut there, or something like that, or the tile, you wouldn't be like, as it gets better and better and better, you may not be able to do that. But I think that, and then the point you made about the idea of misattributing, having actual footage and then saying that it's something that it's not is akin to this as well, and say, we got photos from 2015 and a news organization can show it and say, this is happening last week, and it's like, well, that's deception, and you don't, and from that you wouldn't know what to believe. The difference there, again, the same kind of thing, is that could be refuted. Like that, somebody could show the actual photograph or video from 2015 and say, see, it's the exact same thing. And then you can go from there. So, but the next piece I wanted to get to actually was the larger point overall in dealing with this. And, like the concept of truth decay. And this is, a term that's been studied and so forth, and a concept that's been studied. And in the sense that just not knowing, there not being an objective truth that you can believe in and that we can agree on, so to speak, and how that is becoming more prevalent and how that's going to affect our ability for things like self-governance and just a society where people can get along, how that's an increasing threat. So do you think that what we're seeing here, or just in general, your comments on truth decay, and what do you think that presents for us as challenges moving, as we move forward further into the 21st century?
I think we've already seen those challenges. And that's what I was saying is like, as I was preparing my mind for this discussion, I realized that we've already, through the fracturing of information ecosystems, I mean, these are things that have been talked about, but I'll just regurgitate a few. Like, when you and I were kids, there were much fewer sources of media outlets. So we all kind of sat there and watched the evening news and only had about 4 or 5 different serious versions of it, options in terms of TV channels and all that. And so we all had more of a shared kind of reality, whether that reality was true or not. Because in
Yeah.
preparing for today, I was thinking about things like, and again, not to go on a tangent, but just to mention things like the lost cause. The fact that we still have two narratives about the Civil War, right? Some people really genuinely believe it wasn't about slavery. It was all about the states' rights and all that. Other people believe, yeah, it was about the states that were slave owning states' ability to expand that. And it was about slavery. So the fact that we have a conflict that's 150 plus years old in the United States, and we still have enough disagreement that these things are still being talked about, where, again, we just had a presidential candidate 2-3 months ago that didn't feel comfortable expressing what the real cause of the Civil War was, tells us that this competition for reality is not new. But yes, the ability for us to have such fractured sources of information now, I think this is unprecedented because, and for people listening and not watching, I'm grabbing my cell phone here, just the ability for us to have like reality now here in our face is something new to humanity. And I think that's the like, whether a historical meme or idea was truly factual or not mattered less than the cohesiveness of everybody believing it, so that the society could continue to move in a direction and have less conflict. And I think the issue now is, whether things are true or not, we have more people that believe in many different things, and it's harder for us to kind of get on the same page, especially with big decisions. And I'll finish up this. I think part of it is the complexity of our societies too now. Just a lot of things are very complex, and it's hard to understand everything, which leaves
in the sense that there's more interaction between
conspiracy.
People. Yeah, well, I was going to say, like, that's an objective statement in the sense that there's more interaction between people, and between groups of people and cultures. Like, there was less of that. And so there's going to be less large scale cultural disagreements or different perspectives and so forth. As the world becomes smaller, so to speak, you're going to have more of that. I wanted to define truth decay. The RAND Institute has done a lot on this. And the way they define it is, they say truth decay is defined in part by an increasing disagreement about objective facts. And they cite this as something that's increasing. And it's a trend that, is not, they haven't seen in scale in American history. And, and we'll have some stuff in the show notes on this. The way I look at it is, there's two ways, you can kind of see what's happening, or there's more than two ways, but two ways that I point to in particular. And that is, and you cited to it, but I want to give kind of a why. There's more sources of information. Well, why is that? Because the reason is that if you wanted to get information out 150 years ago, you had to publish books. You had to have access to book publishing equipment. If you go back 100 years, then, or, radio, and then 80 years TV, and you still had to have this broadcasting equipment. You can jump to the 80s and so, and cable, you still had that. There's still the barriers for entry to being a distributor of information was still very high. Now the barriers for entry for distributing information is very low. And so anyone can distribute information and can present it in a certain way and be persuasive with it and so forth. So that necessarily just leads to more sources of information. So you have a wider group of people, just more people putting stuff out there. And the second piece on this is, I think we'll see this more in the future, and we're seeing it now, but the algorithmic ability, or the way through algorithms that information can be presented now, I think plays a big role in it as well. The idea of curation of information, and how that's been done, whether that's been done from a journalistic standpoint or an entertainment standpoint. And I say, like, the difference between the New York Times versus People magazine, like, they're still curating information. They're deciding what to put in front of people. And that's a human being making those decisions. And they might do surveys and stuff like that, but it's a human mind that's trying to work through that. Well, now you're letting algorithms and the computers that are making these decisions millions and millions and millions of times per second make these decisions, and with real world feedback in terms of what actually either will keep you hooked or what's more persuasive and so forth. And so the rate in which we're being hit with and then led into certain realities has increased as well. So to me, I think that you have a confluence of factors that's led to the idea where, okay, we can be siloed very easily because there's all these sources of information, and it can be presented to us in ways that will tickle our brain a certain way that'll get us to walk down the path, to hold the hand and walk down the path with a stranger, so to speak. And when you see that, it almost appears when you look at it, then the whole picture, it almost appears inevitable, that we're entering this phase. And so it's going to be something that society is going to have to reckon with, particularly societies that aren't built around the highest priority, maintaining order. If you're looking at kind of a dictatorship, the highest priority is maintaining order, and the dictator just will shut things down. They want to shut down. But if you have an open society like we have here in the United States, or we try to have here in the United States, it's going to be more and more difficult to get people to and this, they talk about this in the Rand piece, like to see, okay, here are the problems we're dealing with. Here are the factors we need to consider. So therefore, let's then make value judgments on what we should do. Well, if we can't get those first two steps, what are the problems and what are the factors of those problems? Then how are we going to get to the idea of addressing these problems collectively, in a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? So to me, like, this is kind of a fun and games way you can kind of see how this can play out. This multiverse of realities all happening at the same time amongst people in the same neighborhood or in the same state or whatever. But the way how far this can go, it can get really unwieldy very quickly.
Also, kind of following on our theme here, this is where I'm getting at, where I'm concerned about how this goes, because when I say, going back to the kind of complexities of our societies, and you're speaking to it too, is like this fracturing of information also creates distrust because we're fracturing expertise. And what happens, I think the COVID experience, let me put it that way, just that whole kind of period of the pandemic showed us this a lot, where, for the first time in my lifetime, medical doctors and scientists were not trusted by, I don't know if I'm going to say a majority of our population, but enough that it felt disruptive. Remember, we had people that on purpose wanted to listen to people like me and you, podcast hosts that aren't medical professionals, that aren't steeped in scientific research about pathogens and how to, how they work and all that, taking them, being instructed to use drugs that are used on horses, right? And human beings took that advice and went on it. The hydroxychloroquine stuff and all that. And some of it I felt wasn't even about the information itself. It was that they just felt like, well, I just don't want to be told what to do by the system, by the experts and the elites, quote unquote. So I'm just going to go look over here. And so that's my concern, because as I wrote a few notes here as just thinking about it, I've heard this just in my regular life professionally, as well as just dealing with, talking about other things. Think about the stock market, just conceptually, is very complex. I've heard people tell me, oh, the government has these secret accounts where they manipulate the stock market and all that. And I'm just thinking, like, the government doesn't have that much money. The amount of, there's $100 trillion worth of treasury bonds out there. The capitalization of the Dow Jones, I think, is 60 trillion. It's just too big. I've heard people tell me things about the healthcare system that I don't know are true or not. We all know that our healthcare system is a black box in terms of how our health insurance companies get reimbursed. All that is just confusing and all that. Then you got things like immigration, the big topic now. And when you start talking to people and trying to drill down, it's complex. The asylum laws and why people can stay or can't stay when they're seeking certain things and what qualifies for that. So it leaves a lot of room in all these topics for people to put in disinformation, and our minds just want to go to what's comfortable. So we usually regress back to confirmation bias. Whatever we believe before coming into that conversation is like we're a deer in the headlines. It gets so complex that you're kind of like, well, you know what? I'm just going to regress to what I already believe because this stuff is too much. And so I don't see that getting any better either. I think that's going to get worse.
That's a human element. And in the thing, like in the Rand, like one of the Rand pieces, like I said, that we'll have in the show notes, they put out 4 main drivers. And the first one is cognitive biases, like just as you just pointed out there. They also talk about changes in the information ecosystem, which is I was kind of talking about previously. Also, the demands of the educational system and political and social polarization. To me, I think that the trust piece that you mentioned, though, is very important. And the trust piece, trust is a two-way street. And I think part of that, now there are definitely actors who have been, and there's been a concerted effort to break the trust between quote unquote experts and the public. Like that's been a concerted effort. But at the same time, I think the experts, they're not just a pure victim there. It's their job to figure out ways to engage and interact with the public. And I think they've let the public down in that they haven't done enough to the way you establish credibility is by doing things that help the public, and so this wasn't an issue, let's say in the 1960s or 70s or whatever, because the experts were curing polio and they were doing all these very amazing things and building superhighways and all this stuff, and so it's easier to trust when you can look around and see, okay, well, these people are really advancing society. And then also the level of outreach that you need. You got to meet people where they are. If you want to sit in an ivory tower and just, drop commandments down, and then it's going to be difficult to establish that two-way street of trust, particularly in an environment where bad actors are trying to break that bond of trust. But it is something, and actually we'll have another piece in the show notes from the Atlantic talking about this in terms of the role experts play in when you're dealing with complex issues or things that you can't read a paragraph on and then be able to make intelligent decisions on in a society, how important it is to have experts from that standpoint, because these are people that look at this stuff and whose job it is to understand this type of stuff, but whose job, and this is the piece that I think we can't let them off the hook on, is to take these complex things, be able to drill them down for people, and then say, okay, here's what you need to know, here's why, and then meet people where they are. Again, so that piece in society, there is room for improvement on that end as well. My point is not to say that the experts are all bad or that they shouldn't be trusted, but they have room for improvement as well, considering the information environment that we live in now and the competing agendas and the fact that people are attacking it. So my question for you, and I guess we'll get to this, because we're not going to go, it's a surface level discussion, generally speaking, but are there any solutions that you've seen proposed that you find to be things that society should be looking at as far as to try to reverse or at least stop the spread of truth decay? It's something it's something that's important to do if we're going to, again, maintain a government of the people, by the people, for the people, because the people need information that they can make decisions on. And this isn't 100% of the people need it, but a large number of people need information to be able to make decisions on in order to keep the society working, or else we're going to be making decisions based on fabricated realities, which may not work out in the favor of the populace.
Yeah, I think, you hit it, things already that I think would make sense in terms of outreach, people that are concerned about this, that take it serious, trying to meet people where they are. And
just
I
for example, real quick, you mentioned how people were believing podcast hosts. Why aren't these experts going to all these popular? They should be presenting themselves. Hey, and again, it's not every expert, but the ones who are good at the public relations piece, or they need to be going to these places too. They can't. Again, it can't be sitting in an ivory tower. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think look, we have a lot of problems that are in the way of that, and I say problems, not that they're bad things, but they're just hurdles. Maybe that's a better word than problems, like the freedom of speech. So there's a certain level of freedom that we all have, that we can say certain things, right? And then private ownership of corporations. So, for example, there's people like, the guy that bought Twitter, for example. He seems to be provocative things on his site, and he doesn't seem to welcome the type of experts that you and I would consider to be experts in their field, because it goes against the grain of the ethos of what he believes in, which is,
unless they agree with him.
Yeah, unless they agree with him. No, this whole thing about, I want to let everyone say what they feel. And to your point, unless I disagree with it, like the recent interview he did with Don Lemon, then he cancels the whole thing, right? So that's one of the problems, is that we have corporations that are controlled by people that want to continue this fomenting of misinformation and disinformation. Because I got from one of the articles we read from preparation for today, I got a new term. They call them conflict entrepreneurs, and that they gain power and wealth by deepening divides through attacks on expertise. And I'm not even going to drop names. I mean, there's a lot of people, podcast hosts, cable news hosts. There's politicians in the Senate and the Congress that behave this way, right? That experts aren't to be trusted. And so what do we do? How do we change that? I'm not sure, because I think it would take, actually, at a regulatory and legislative level, two things. One is, maybe because of freedom of speech, you can't tell people they can't say things, but we could almost deal with things, and you've mentioned this in the past conversations, like false advertising. You just can't call yourself news anymore if you're not somehow bringing up real factual stuff. You could just call yourself opinion.
Or if you're majority opinion. Yeah, and I mean, I've been making that point for years. If you're majority opinion, if what you do is opinion work primarily, then you shouldn't have in your name that you're a news organization. Like that to me is deceptive. And actually, we've seen that. Like one of the pieces that again, is in the show notes, talks about, and I jumped on this. The forcing better disclosure in terms of helping people decipher the difference between what presentations are factual and what presentations are opinion, and that's the heart of the point I've been making. And I'm an intellectual property attorney, so to me that stands out. It's like, oh, hold up, that's false designation of origin. If you're saying, hey, I'm a news organization, but then the majority of the content that you put out there that gets consumed is opinion, then that's deceptive. That's the people are, you're confusing people on that.
And that's where I'm saying that the other piece I was going to say, and you're kind of alluding to it, is really the, regulation, right? And again, that's a word, and I feel like regulation is like anything else in an ecosystem. Too much of it can be detrimental and catastrophic. It could suffocate growth and a capitalist system and all that. But too little of it is also catastrophic. And so you need a healthy equilibrium. And what's happened, I mean, this goes back to my thing on education, but I could say this happened with the regulatory environment as well. The internet exploded so quickly and there were so many new things to kind of think about and tackle, that by the time the regulatory apparatus of the government could even think about catching up with the lightning speed of the growth of some of these companies like Meta and Twitter and all these other type of internet and YouTube through Google, it's kind of been too late, because they already occupy such a dominance in our lives and also in their lobbying, right? They become now bigger than fossil fuel, bigger than tobacco, and the food industry, like the trans fats and the salts and sugars. So now we've got another industry that's huge, that's affecting us negatively, and that now we're going to have to play this game about fighting an uphill battle against very moneyed interests who are conflict entrepreneurs. They're making a lot of profit by having this stuff proliferate through our society. So it's going to be an uphill battle. And I don't know where it ends.
I think you got to remember, and the point is has been made, in discussion on truth decay, is that you don't change, you don't stop it, you chip away at it, and there's a lot of things that need to be done. I'm always, when I talk about this type of stuff, and because I'm a person that thinks that freedom of speech from a governmental regulation level is very important, but I also think that deception is not something. Deception, things like that is not something that should be permitted under the guise of freedom of speech. Tricking people, fraud, stuff like that, defamation. Those are the natural checks on freedom of speech that are already in place. But what I'm always reminded of, because a lot of times these things seem overwhelming, is just the old wisdom that you can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all the time. And so implicit in that is that some of this stuff is going, like whatever the mechanism, some of this stuff is going to be here with us at all times, and so there are some people who don't want the truth, like that they will be more comforted by a subjective reality, a synthetic reality that centers them or centers whatever worldview they have and that validates that. Like there are people who think the world is flat, and so like that's not going away. Like that's not a problem of truth decay. That's just, you're always going to have people staking out positions that, are contrary to what is observable, or, again, the problem that we're going to run into is what is observable may not be trustworthy either. But nonetheless, I think when you're looking at a concept like this, the biggest piece is going to be, and there's a lot of, there have been a lot of things thrown out, but the biggest thing is there's going to have to be some outlets, some organizations are going to have to outwardly hold themselves to a higher standard and then have transparency. And that's with whether it's media organizations that are going to have transparency as far as what are their standards, what are they doing, but also government organizations, expert groups, trade associations. Transparency, hold yourself to a high standard and then be clear what that standard is. And then if you don't live up to that standard, then you have to do something about it. Somebody has to get fired or somebody has to step down, even though it might be overall a good person, and that's the way that you have to rebuild the trust and maintain the trust, is to have these transparent expectations and standards that you hold yourself to. and then be willing to live up to that, because inevitably people will cross these lines, and sometimes it'll be painful. It won't be something that, like you're happy about, or that you might think people go overboard. The example to me, I thought that is again, it's something that some people would consider overboard. It's just that in the heat of the Me Too movement, when then the Democratic Party was like, okay, yeah, we're going to take a harder look at this stuff, and Al Franken gets accused of something that many considered pretty innocuous. Like, it wasn't, like sexual harassment as it's been defined, that typically, but he stepped down, and he was like, all right, well, then I'm out. And a lot of people were like, whoa, wow, that's kind of extreme. But the point was to try to set a high standard and then live up to it, even if it was to your own detriment. And I'm not saying that to put him on a pedestal or anything like that, but I do think it was a good illustration of something that many people, not all people, some people thought it was appropriate, but many people who were in the Democratic Party were like, whoa, that's a little much, isn't it? Like, let's kind of vet this out. Let's see, is this stuff credible, or if what you're saying is true, or what she's saying is true, is that something that warrants this or whatever? But the idea of holding yourself to a higher standard won out there. And that's the kind, if you can behave like that consistently, that is how you build and maintain trust. But it has to be based on transparency and actually living up to the standards. So any last thoughts before we get out of here?
Yes, I was going to say, you landed that plane very well, because I thought you were about to step in a huge landmine when you brought up Me Too and Alfred.
No, it's
where's he going? But
I thought that was an interesting one to begin, because there were people disagreed on whether he should do that. The point of trying to hold yourself to a higher standard was what he was trying to do.
No, and I was going to joke and say, yeah, after you got done with your rant here, like, yeah, that's if you care about this stuff, like transparency and all that. That's a point about the conflict entrepreneurs. But
that's my point, is that it's not, you're never going to get them in terms of to stop doing it. And you better be careful trying to regulate them out of existence beyond defamation, beyond deception. But like those things, obviously,
it's like regulate. But if you really try to outlaw the whole thing, it's going to maybe get worse in a certain way. So if you let it just be legal and regulated, it's like you're saying, there's always going to be people that believe the Earth's flat, and we can't change that. We just don't need 80% of the population believing it.
And we need the people who want the real information to know where they can find the real information. Like, that's really the bigger thing, is that the people who want the fake stuff, you're not going to, there's little you can do about that. But the people who want the real stuff, make sure that they know, here's where you can find the real stuff. Here's the kind of, the justification for it. Here's how we conduct our operation. Here's why you can trust us. So, well, thank you for joining us on part one. We'll wrap it up from here, and we'll get to part two here shortly.